Okay, so the next thing we're going to cover, this will be part 10 of passenger check ride in a Robinson R44. And the next subject that we're going to look at, or next section, is going to be part F. The task will be performance and limitations. Right? So when you look at the performance and limitations, there's several charts and tables that you need to be aware of, and we're going to go over those quite extensively here. So the first of these charts that we're actually going to look at are the ones that are actually contained within the aircraft itself, and that being the charts for the VNE and also your max manifold pressure charts. And I've blown these up a little bit to make them a little easier to look at. In earlier models, R44s, they were actually located above your head. They were kind of difficult to try to read and fly the aircraft at the same time. So Robinson got smart and they put it down. Now it's on the T-bar handle, and it rolls around. It's easy to move around. You can look at it much easier without flipping your head up and getting disoriented trying to read the chart while you're flying. Okay, so to look at these charts, the first one here we'll look at is actually the limit manifold pressure chart. And I'm sure you guys have used these things extensively by now in your training, but I would like to show you a couple little things there. So you basically just taking your temperature here and plotting it against your altitude. All right, pressure altitude versus temperature, which gives you density altitude. All right, and if it's in between that, if here we're showing sea level 2,000, 4, 6, and if it's in between say 2 and 4,000, then you would extrapolate between the two figures that you come up with. Let's say it's 20 degrees outside and you're at 3,000 feet. Well, you'd go with 20 degrees here at 2,000 feet would be 23.7 inches, and here at 4,000 feet would be 23.4 inches. And right in between those two would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 23.5, 23.6 inches. So if it's not exactly at one of the exact altitude levels, you have to sort of extrapolate and estimate and come up with your numbers there. Okay, and one of the things I wanted to show you is that if you notice on this R44 Raven 1, you'll notice that the limit manifold pressure chart only goes up to about 6,000 feet here, okay? That's kind of a hint. When you're flying the aircraft, if you're going to be operating in altitudes much more than about 6,000 feet, you probably need to be in a Raven 2 instead of Raven 1, all right? The Raven 2 has much better high altitude performance than the Raven 1 does. Now I'll show you, here's the limit manifold pressure chart here for Raven 2. You notice it goes all the way up to 10,000 feet. And so you have an additional 3,000 or 4,000 feet of performance available to you in a Raven 2 that's just not there in a Raven 1. So again, if you're getting up much above about 6,000 or 7,000 feet, you really need to be in a Raven 2 and not in a Raven 1. But, okay, continuing on the, since again we're looking mostly at the Raven 1 here. Down here on the never exceed speed, or VNE chart, then down here in good old thick air, it's 130 knots, and really until you get up to about 6,000 feet, you really have to start paying a whole lot of attention to the temperature, but you know, you want to work the chart every time. The one thing I wanted to point out to you on this chart is that a lot of people miss this part down here, that over 2,200 pounds takeoff gross weight, you're supposed to subtract 10 knots off the VNE here. And for auto rotation speed, you should subtract 30 knots for your maximum VNE in an auto rotation. So a lot of people sort of miss that. And so if he was to ask you, it's you know, he gives you the weight of the aircraft, that may be a hint. Let's say is that, you know, you're near max gross weight and you're at 6,000 feet and it's 20 degrees outside. You know, so here's 6,000 feet, 20 degrees, 113. Well, you need to subtract 10 off that because you're near max gross weight, and then VNE would actually be 103 instead. So how about the R44 Cadet? How does it compare? And we'll look here at the chart for the R44 Cadet, and you'll notice that the R44 Cadet goes up to about 8,000 feet. All right. So the Cadet performance is somewhere in between. It's better than the Raven 1, not quite as good as the Raven 2, but it has pretty decent performance at relatively high altitudes. Right? And you'll notice that there's some slight differences in the charts as well. And you want to be sure that whichever aircraft you're doing the check ride in, the Raven 1, the Cadet, or the Raven 2, that you're well versed on the differences in the chart. The Raven 1, when you look at it, you're only allowed for your takeoff power, you're allowed to add 1.6 inches of manifold pressure. Right? In the Cadet, you add 2 inches of manifold pressure for takeoff power, And then finally in the Raven 2, you actually can add 2.8 inches to your max continuous power to figure your maximum takeoff power. So you want to be sure that you're well versed in which, and looking at the charts, and make sure you understand how the charts differ. I'll show you another little difference here. So in the Raven 1 and the Raven 2, I showed you that part that everybody seems to sort of miss down here on the bottom about subtracting 10 off the VNE if you're at max gross weight. Well, in the Cadet, and subtracting 30 off the auto rotation speed. Well, in the Cadet, it's even different from that, and it doesn't list. You're only going to 2,200 pounds in a Cadet, so you don't have to figure it different based on if you're not supposed to be greater than 2,200 pounds. But it does have a correction for auto rotation speed, and for auto rotation speed, you're supposed to subtract 20 knots off of your listed VNE to have your maximum auto rotational speed. So it could generate a lot of different questions. If he asks you what your max VNE during an auto rotation would be, you need to kind of practice a little bit and figure out how to do that. And I'll just show you an example here on the Cadet where we're subtracting 20. Then let's say 6,020, 20 degrees outside. Here's 6,000, here's 20 degrees, it's 103. So your maximum speed in an auto rotation at 6,000 feet and 20 degrees outside, you'd have to subtract 20, would be 83 knots, all right? So, and again, they're all slightly different, so you need to be sure and look at the one that you have and make sure that you know how to plug the numbers in and get the correct numbers for the, in case he was to generate some questions that he'll throw at you. Another one they're going to throw at you is, and this is a great one, is right here where it says, as your takeoff weight is greater, you have to subtract 10 knots from your VNE. And why? Why do you have to lower the VNE? Why is the VNE lower the heavier that you are? Have you ever thought about that one? Well, the answer is, as the weight of the aircraft goes up, the amount of collective that you have to pull, i.e. the angle of attack on the blades, has to increase. As a blade angle increases, then the amount of teetering present has to increase as well. And I did a number of videos on dissymmetry of lift. There's about 8 or 9 of them. Wouldn't be a bad idea to look at those. It's quite extensive. I go into it in way more depth probably than you really need to. But you definitely need to understand this basic concept that the heavier the aircraft is, requires more power, i.e. more angle of attack on the blades to support that greater weight, and the amount of teetering that occurs on the rotor disc has to increase. As teetering increases, the speed at which a retreating blade stall would occur goes down and down and down. So at heavier airspeeds, a retreating blade stall will occur sooner. It's like everything else in a helicopter. Everything that's bad in a helicopter gets worse when you start getting heavy. Okay, so the next charts that we're going to look at are going to be the OGE and the IGE hover charts, and that's out of ground effect hover chart and in-ground effect hover chart. And I went ahead and blew these up again to make them easier to look at. These are contained within Chapter 5, the Performance chapter, within the POH. And the most important thing when using these two charts is first, identify that you're on the right chart. You have the correct chart, and then you're not looking at the wrong one, all right? So we're going to look at in-ground effect hover first, all right? The chart is relatively easy to use. Again, I've mentioned that down here flying near, our elevation here is only 342 feet at the airport, and we get spoiled because we really don't have to look at these charts at all. The aircraft will do an out-of-ground effect hover all the way to max gross weight down here in good old thick air near sea level, and we don't have to look at it much. But if you start operating in, once you start getting up in altitude, you really need to take a gander at these charts and make sure that you're not, so you know whether aircraft you can expect the thing's going to be able to maintain an in-ground effect hover or an out-of-ground effect hover. So first off, you want to, again, select the correct chart, the in-ground effect hover chart. And again, I'll use the example of 6,000 feet, 20 degrees outside, and how much would the aircraft, what's the max weight the aircraft could weigh, and still do an in-ground effect hover at 6,000 feet and 20 degrees Celsius, right? So basically you just go up this side. Again, this is pressure altitude on this side. Here's your temperatures, plus 40, 30, 20, 10. And you just go up to 6,000 feet here and bring this line over to where it intersects with the 20 degree temperature line, which is right here then you would bring that straight down, and it gives you the max weight that the aircraft would do. An in-ground effect hover would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,320 pounds. Pretty close to max gross weight, but not quite there. All right. Now, look how this changes when you do an out-of-ground effect hover. So again, first thing you want to do, make sure that you have the correct chart. So here's the out-of-ground OGE hover chart, right? And again, the pressure altitude is on this side, and here's our bands for temperature here. And again, we just go up to 6,000 feet, come across to 20 degrees, which is right here, bring that down, and you're only looking at it somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,040 pounds. So 2,040 pounds. It would do an in-ground effect hover at about 2,320. It would only do an out-of-ground effect hover to about 300 pounds less than that. So it can be significant. It takes a lot more power, and the amount of weight that the aircraft would support in an out-of-ground effect hover is considerably less. In round numbers, right at 300 pounds. So what kind of questions are you expected to have to answer pertaining to the OGE and the IGE charts? Well, you could ask questions several different ways. It could just come right out and say, you're at this altitude, at this temperature, what would be the maximum weight that the aircraft would be able to sustain an out-of-ground effect hover or an in-ground effect hover? Or he may give you the weight of the aircraft. Your aircraft now weighs 2,200 pounds, and you're at this altitude and this temperature. Will the aircraft do it? And so you just have to work the numbers and see whether that weight is within the limits where the aircraft would actually sustain the hover. So like I say, you could be asked several different ways. You just have to be well versed on how to work the chart, and it's pretty simple actually. So it's not much of a difficulty working the chart. And again, the charts for out-of-ground effect and in-ground effect hover are going to be slightly different based on which aircraft you're looking at, whether it's the Raven 1, the Raven 2, or the Cadet. So just be sure that you are able to work those charts. Essentially, it's the same process with each chart. The only thing that's going to be different is the numbers. The performance is much better on the Cadet and the Raven 2. So just understand that there's some differences in the chart. Okay, so the next chart that we're going to look at is the height velocity diagram. And this one is quite an important one. So when you look at the height velocity diagram, you'll notice that it's going to have a shaded area here, which is the avoid area. That gives you both altitude and airspeed combinations that you want to try to avoid like the plague. All right. The reason being is if you're in this shaded area and you lose the engine, if you're outside of the shaded area, it's relatively easy to perform a successful auto rotation, and if you're within the shaded area, it's relatively difficult. All right, you may be able to. Obviously, if you enter the auto rotation, you're not going to get a blade stall, but you're going to hit awfully hard and do much more damage to the aircraft if you find yourself operating within the shaded section of the height velocity curve. One of the things that you definitely need to note on the chart is that here's the sea level. Here's the line for sea level at 2,400 pounds is right here, right? And the line for 7,000 foot density altitude and even lighter, 2,100 pounds, is much higher, like this, right? All right, one of the questions they're going to ask you is why, if you're at a much higher altitude, why is the height above the ground that you need to be at for any given airspeed much higher to be able to successfully auto rotate the aircraft? And the answer is because you're in much thinner air, right? The higher you go, the less dense the air is, and you have to put more of that thin air through the rotor disc to drive it to produce the same effect. So you'll notice that as you go to higher altitudes, you have to start extrapolating to higher and higher heights above the ground that you should be able to successfully perform an auto rotation. So he'll definitely ask you some permutation of a question concerning that. If you're at 5,000 feet and you're going 40 knots, what would be a safe altitude? Or how about if you're 7,000 feet and 40 knots, what would be a safe altitude? Would it be higher or lower? You know, so obviously it's going to be higher the higher the altitude. So now one of the things they may or may not ask you about is that the height velocity curve is basically designed for takeoff. Shows the takeoff profile down here, you know, where speed you're supposed to maintain. And then one of their favorite questions is, do we ever operate normally, ever operate under normal conditions within the height velocity curve? And the answer is yes, we do, on approach. All right, on approach. Will sometimes be in this section of the height velocity curve, sometimes called the knee of the height velocity curve here, because on approach sometimes you may be in a combination of airspeed and altitude that would get you into this section of the shaded section of the height velocity curve. All right, then the next question that generates is, okay, why is that considered relatively safe? How come you can, on approach, you could be in the knee of the height velocity curve here, but on takeoff, if you were in the height velocity, in the shaded section of the height velocity curve, why is that considered quote unquote dangerous? Right? Do you ever stop and think about that one? And the answer is, think about your collective position. When you're taking off with the aircraft, you know, you're pulling, you know, you got collective up under your armpit, you know, and you're taking off out of there. And if the engine quits, because you're at such a high angle of attack, you got the collective way up there, you know, if that engine quits, the blades are going to rapidly slow down, going to rapidly degrade rotor RPM. Well, think about approach. When you're coming in on approach, you got the collective down, almost down to an auto. You may only be a half inch off the stop or whatever on the approach. And if the engine quits, the rate at which your rotor RPM degrades is much slower. Take that, much less degradation in rotor RPM with loss of the engine, okay? So that's why it's considered safe on approach to operate somewhat within the knee of the height velocity curve, all right? Next question, he's going to point out the fact that there is a second shaded area here at high speed, relatively higher speeds, on the height velocity curve. And the question is, why? Why do you have a second shaded area here at low altitudes and high airspeeds? And the answer is because during auto rotation, when you enter an auto rotation, what's changing is you're going from powered blades that are pushing air down through the blades and you know, producing lift, to the airflow has to change to now coming up through the blades to drive them to perform the auto rotation. And that's always associated with an altitude loss of generally somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 25 feet or greater sometimes, right? So if you're tooling along and you're only 20 feet off the ground and you're going 100 knots, if the engine quits on it, you and the earth are going to become one before any possibility of actually entering the auto. You're going to lose at least that much altitude, and the aircraft is going to impact the ground going basically whatever your cruise speed was. So if you're asked about why the shaded part here, the simple answer is because when you enter an auto rotation, there's always an associated altitude loss of, you know, say 25 feet or so. And if you're at altitude less than that, whatever at your airspeed, you're going to be, you know, you and the earth are going to become one before you actually get in truly into an auto rotation. So what's some other questions that you may have to feel concerning the height velocity curve? Well, one of their favorite ways to ask questions is they'll give you an airspeed and ask you what's a safe height or safe altitude to be at that airspeed. Well, there's always two answers, right? So let's say that he asked you, so you're going 20 knots. What would be a safe altitude to be at an airspeed of 20 knots at? The first answer is hover height, all right? So skids 4 to 6 feet off the ground, and a regular hover height is considered safe at 20 knots, all right? The other one, you'd have to then look at the chart, and you know, so here we are at 20 knots, and if you're down here in good old thick air, and you bring your 20 knot line up to here, it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 325 feet. If you're operating down here in good old thick air near sea level, just remember that the top of the height velocity curve for those conditions would be 400 feet. And if you're operating in an altitude somewhat less than or somewhat greater than that, then again you just have to kind of extrapolate what the altitude or the height above the ground would be. How about he asks you 30 knots? How about so he says, okay, so you're in the aircraft and you're going 30 knots. What altitude would be considered safe at 30 knots? All right. Again, hover height. All right, 4 to 6 feet. Skids 4 to 6 feet off the ground would be considered safe. You can do a hovering auto with forward motion easily at 30 knots. Slide it across the ground, and hopefully you got something to slide it across. not a fence row or a ditch. And then the second part of that answer at 30 knots would be, first part is hover height. The second part would be, again, bringing it up to here and seeing that it's about somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 feet or so. All right. And then again, once you get it at airspeeds past about 50 knots, I like to use about 50 to 55 knots, but once you're at an airspeed in excess of about 50 knots, essentially any height, any altitude, you could do a successful auto rotation from. All right. So just remember, if he gives you an airspeed, there's always, for the most part, two answers: hover height and whatever the much higher altitude would be. And then once you've achieved a forward airspeed of 50 to 55 knots or greater, essentially it's pretty easy to do a successful auto rotation from about any altitude above the ground, until you finally get up to where you're at higher speeds and low level, and then that's again an area that you want to avoid. So if he was to ask you, you're in the aircraft going 80 knots, what would be a safe height to be, safe altitude to be going 80 knots in the aircraft? And if you look at it, it's going to be from about 25 feet on up higher. So, and those are the type of questions that they're likely going to have to field concerning the height velocity curve. Okay, so the next section, or the next thing we're going to just discuss in the performance and limitation sections is weight and balance. Now let me give you guys a little bit of inside information here. Most of the DPEs now will let you use an app on your phone to figure your weight and balance. And I know that Tim Tucker has one that's, I think it's sold through Geronimo Systems or whoever, and that both of the DPEs that do about 90% of our check rides allow you to use that and not have to do it the old-fashioned way of taking the thing out on a piece of paper, making 6 lines, writing it all out, which takes about 15 minutes to do. You can do it with the app in a matter of about 30 seconds. Also on that app, it has the performance chart for IGE and OGE hover, and the flight envelope shown on there, and everything that you need is right there on the app. Now, I don't own Geronimo Systems. I'm friends with Tim Tucker, but I'm not getting a cut out of this. But I'll just tell you that if you have that on your phone, it's much easier to do the weight and balance on that, and it's much easier to do the weight and balance in real life if you have that app on your phone as well. So just a little inside information there. Get the app. It's not that expensive. I think it's 20 or 30 bucks, and use that app and save yourself some trouble. Okay, well here I found the app on, here's what it looks like on the internet. There's a little advertisement for it for the R44s, Tim Tucker's R44 Raven and Astro. And they have, and again it shows here, it's got you just plug in the weights of the passengers, how much fuel down here on the bottom. You actually have to program in the empty weight of the aircraft and the moments in it, but once that's loaded in, it's very easy to use. Shows the performance charts over here, and then the flight envelope and manifold pressure and VNE charts are on that side. So again, it's a very nice app to have, and there may be other apps with it that work just as well. I don't know. I'm aware of this one. A lot of the students are getting this app, and it seems to work very well. So again, it would be an advantage to have that on your phone. So one of the things under performance and limitations, it asks you to describe the effect of atmospheric conditions on the helicopter's performance. And there's a little saying called high, hot, and humid. And those three things kill off your performance, both in a helicopter and an airplane. So high altitude or high temperatures, hot, obviously hot temperatures, and high humidity, they all reduce the performance of the aircraft. Right? In an airplane, what you see is at high, hot, and humid conditions, on takeoff, it takes a much longer ground run to get into the air. It's why you'll notice if you're out west, like at Grand Canyon National, 6,500 feet or so in the air there, and they got great big old long runways because it takes the airplanes a much longer run to get into the air at higher altitude. But in a helicopter, what you're going to see there with high, hot, and humid is a decrease in the height or elevation that the aircraft will actually hover at, and then you'll also see that it kind of kills off the climb performance of the aircraft. So high, hot, and hover rear their ugly head, and with helicopters, that decreasing the hover performance and decreasing the rate of climb with the helicopter. Next thing we're going to talk about is a retreating blade stall. Right? retreating blade stall, and it's going to ask you what the cause and the effect of a retreating blade stall is. All right, the cause of a retreating blade stall is you're going too damn fast for the conditions you're in. Okay, plain and simple. And as I alluded to earlier, the speed at which a retreating blade stall, or which VNE is set to, or where you're exceeding VNE and get a retreating blade stall, as you go up in altitude, goes to a much slower and slower and slower airspeed as you increase your altitude. All right, so you guys need to be aware of there's three things that increase the amount of teetering that has to occur in a helicopter. Right, so rotor disc teeters to compensate for dissymmetry of lift. There's three things that cause an increase, with everything else being the same, an increase in the amount of teetering. And those three things are: number one, increase in airspeed. An increase in airspeed will always increase the amount of teetering that occurs in the rotor disc. All right, as you increase your airspeed, you're increasing flow across the blades, and that increase in flow is always greatest at the 3 o'clock position, and the amount of teetering has to increase. All right. Number two, an increase in the angle of attack. All right, angle of attack in either the individual blade itself or in the increase in the angle of attack of the rotor disc. If you were to come back on the stick, you're increasing the angle of attack of the rotor disc. All right, and then the third thing is a decrease in rotor RPM. A decrease in rotor RPM, again, everything else being equal, necessitates an increase in the amount of flapping that has to occur. All right. So with a retreating blade stall, what happens is you're essentially going too fast for the conditions you're in. The amount of teetering becomes excessive, and what you'll feel with an impending retreating blade stall, let's say that you were to slowly just keep pushing forward on the stick until you got basically to right on the edge of a retreating blade stall, what you'll find is that as the blades come around, it's going to be teetering excessively, and the droop stops are going to be hitting the mast. All right, and that's going to occur 2 times per revolution. Right, so you get twice per revolution, you get the droop stops pounding against the mast. The RPM and the blade RPM in a Robinson helicopter in R44 is right at 400, 404, whatever. So 2 times for that, so you're going to get 800 hertz vibration in the stick, which is fairly noticeable. So only come close to encountering that one time at high altitudes, and I got into a significant updraft crossing the mountain range out by Albuquerque, and got into a bit of a impending retreating blade stall. The more important thing to know is what to do about it. If you think you're in an impending retreating blade stall because the combination of things have gotten you into where you have an impending retreating blade stall, you want to, the main question is going to be, how are you going to correct for that? And the first thing you have to do, and if you get this wrong, you're going to die. All right, so they're going to ask you, plain and simple, you're flying along and you're crossing at 11,000 feet of mountain range, and you get on the upwind side of it, and suddenly the stick is vibrating at about 800 hertz, and you discover that you're in an impending retreating blade stall. What or how are you going to respond? And the first thing you have to do is lower the collective. Right, when you lower the collective, you decrease the angle of attack on the blades, you decrease the amount of teetering across the rotor disc, and life is much better. Also, when you lower the collective, you're also decreasing the amount of power going to the rotor disc, and even that will somewhat slow you down some as well. So the first thing you do, step number 1, is lower the collective. If you say, well, I'd slow down, I'd come back on the stick and slow down, you just killed yourself. When you came back on the stick, you're going to increase the angle of attack to the rotor disc. The amount of teetering would actually increase, and you run the risk of, and I hate to use this terminology, but some people call it a high-speed mast bumping, where you'd exceed, in a retreating blade stall, the blades come around, chop off the tail boom, and snap the mast in two. Essentially the same effect as same results rather, as a mast bumping event. So if asked, and it gives you a scenario, you're getting into what you think you're getting into, an impending retreating blade stall. The recovery goes like this. Number 1, lower the collective. Number 2, level the wings. If you're in any degree of a turn, level the wings. And then 3, slowly bring the nose up. All right. If you're still alive, unless you do something stupid like suddenly come back on the stick to slow down, You're going to remain alive if you recover in that particular order. Number 1, lower the collective. Number 2, level the wings. And 3, super slow on raising the nose up to slow down. Right? And that's what you need to know about a retreating blade stall. Okay, so that'll do it for part 10, and we'll take this up again in part 11. And if you haven't done so yet, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next video.